All right, welcome to class, everybody. Whether you're a seasoned student of the social sciences or this is literally your first time stepping foot in a sociology lecture, today's explainer is going to completely change the way you look at the world around you. Our goal today is to unravel this really dense but absolutely fascinating framework. It's called reflexive cultural materialism. Now, I know that sounds like a massive mouthful of academic jargon, but stick with me here. By the end of this lecture, you're going to see it as the invisible code of society itself. We are going to look at the world as material, cultural, and lived all at the exact same time. Okay, let's dive right in. Here's the roadmap for our explainer today. We'll start with a welcome to the core of sociology, then hit the economic foundations, move into culture, power, and resistance, explore agency and the self, look at consciousness and lived experience, and finally bring it all together into reflexive cultural materialism. So, part 1. Welcome to sociology and what I like to call the core paradox. Okay, so we're starting off with the fundamental paradox that sits at the very heart of all sociological thinking. On one hand, we have to recognize a deceptively simple truth. Human beings do not just float freely in the world. You and I, we don't invent ourselves from scratch. We are profoundly and continuously shaped by social structures, by cultural meanings, and by historical conditions. But, and this is a big but, we are not passive products of our environment either. We aren't robots. We interpret, we negotiate, we resist, and we transform the world around us. This duality right here, being shaped by society while simultaneously shaping it, that is literally what sociology is all about. Moving on to part 2, the economic foundations, or the roots of struggle. To really understand how we get shaped, we've got to start at the absolute base. We need to look at the material and economic roots of struggle, and to do that, we're looking through the eyes of the foundational thinker Karl Marx. Marx famously said, "The ruling ideas of every epoch are the ideas of the ruling class." He powerfully argued that to understand any society, you have to look at how it actually produces and distributes its material goods. He posits that capitalism is built on structural exploitation, specifically extracting what he calls surplus value from workers. Because workers produce far more value than they actually receive in their paychecks, capitalists accumulate profit. For Marx, this is not about individual bad bosses being greedy. It's the core organizing principle of the whole system. And ultimately, that economic reality dictates the dominant worldview or the ruling ideas of society. Let's unpack Marx's economic base a bit more. That extraction of surplus value, that's what creates profit. Think about a factory worker building high-end smartphones. That worker is paid a tiny fraction of the total value of the phones they assemble in a single day, while the factory owner pockets the rest. That surplus inherently leads to structural inequality. And this economic arrangement, it trickles up to shape everything else. Politics just becomes a struggle over those resources, and culture gets infused with ideas that try to justify the inequality. But look, Marx doesn't just see this as permanent, unchangeable domination. The really crucial takeaway here is that conflict is the actual engine of social change. When workers experience alienation and insecurity, it naturally sparks class struggle. For Marx, that struggle is just the inevitable result of the tension between workers and capitalists. All right, part 3, culture, power, and resistance. So now that we've got a handle on the economic base, let's explore our next really big question. If this exploitation is structural, how is it hidden and sustained so effectively by our culture? Why aren't people just constantly revolting? Well, this brings us to Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci extends Marx's ideas by showing us that the ruling class maintains power not just by brute force or the police, but by actively manufacturing consent. He calls this process hegemony. It's this wild phenomenon where the exploited actually come to accept the social order as completely natural or even desirable. And how do they pull that off? Through institutions. Schools, the media, religion. They quietly teach us to see the world in ways that perfectly align with the powerful. Like the idea that success is 100% based on individual effort, which totally obscures any structural barriers. But Gramsci also points out that hegemony is never complete. It is always being contested by our actual lived experiences when they rub up against that dominant ideology. Building brilliantly on what Gramsci started, we get Pierre Bourdieu, and he introduces this amazing concept called habitus. Habitus refers to those durable, deeply ingrained dispositions we acquire through our upbringing. It's how we think, feel, and act naturally, without ever really consciously reflecting on it. You can think of it as your cultural capital. It is the very real difference between knowing exactly which fork to use at some high society networking dinner versus feeling completely out of place and sweating through your shirt. A kid from a middle-class background might grow up with a natural sense of ease in institutional settings, whereas a working-class kid might unconsciously develop a sense of self-limitation. And here's the kicker. Schools and institutions actually reward the right cultural capital, specific tastes, ways of speaking, credentials. So inequality isn't just about the money in your bank account, it's physically reproduced through seemingly natural tastes and behaviors. Then we have Stuart Hall, who completes our cultural layer by showing us that culture is a battlefield of representation, not just a passive mirror reflecting reality. Media producers deliberately encode dominant messages into the content they create. But here's the fun part. We, the audience, don't just passively absorb those messages like sponges. We decode them, and we do it based on our own social position. A news broadcast blaming poverty entirely on individual laziness might be totally accepted by one viewer, but completely rejected by another viewer who clearly sees the structural causes at play. Hall proves that culture is exactly where hegemony is either actively maintained or totally disrupted. Which brings us to part 4, agency and the self. This leads us perfectly into a really critical turning point for this explainer. Because if culture and the economy are doing all this incredible heavy lifting, where do we actually fit in? Are we just cogs in a giant machine? Sociologist Anthony Gittin says, absolutely not. He empowers us with this concept called structuration. He completely rejects the idea that we are just passive products. Instead, he proposes a duality. Yes, structures absolutely shape our actions, but our actions simultaneously reproduce or transform those exact same structures. Think about gender norms for a second. They heavily shape how we are expected to behave, sure, but our daily, individual behaviors can also challenge and entirely redefine those very norms over time. Giddens introduces reflexivity, our capacity to monitor what we're doing and actively navigate these complex environments to actually change the social order. And George Herbert Mead brings this dynamic right down to the micro level of your own identity. Mead shows that the self is actually a constant interaction between the me and the I. The me is the internalized attitudes of society, all those norms and expectations placed on you by the outside world. But the I? That's your spontaneous, creative, entirely individual response to those expectations. So the self emerges dynamically through this ongoing internal conversation. We actively interpret and respond to society. We definitely don't just blindly follow the script. Part 5, consciousness and lived experience. Now we need to examine how we actually feel these massive macro forces in our everyday lives. Enter Edmund Husserl, who gives us the concept of the life world. Husserl teaches us that we don't encounter society as a set of abstract bullet points or charts. We encounter it phenomenologically. I know, that's a big, intimidating word, but all it really means is we experience society as a realm of totally taken-for-granted meanings and assumptions. It's the background noise of reality that we almost never stop to question. Husserl reminds us that exploitation and domination aren't just academic concepts drawn on a chalkboard. They are deeply lived experiences that actively filter how we perceive reality itself. Ken Plummer takes this and connects it right back to us with the power of narrative. Narratives are the bridge between biography and society. We literally use cultural templates, like the classic story of the self-made individual or powerful tales of collective struggle, to construct stories that give our own lives coherence and meaning. Plummer argues that the stories we tell about ourselves are exactly where structural power and our individual agency collide head-on. We interpret our experiences through stories, and those stories dictate how we actually act in the real world. And finally, part 6, the grand finale. Reflexive cultural materialism. Okay, class, we have finally reached the climax of today's lecture. We are going to synthesize all 8 of these brilliant thinkers into one unified dynamic framework. This is the big takeaway for today. 1. Material power and exploitation form the base of struggle. That's Marx. 2. That struggle is mediated through culture via hegemony and habitus, just like Gramsci, Bourdieu, and Hall showed us. 3. But within those rigid structures, reflexive agents, meaning you and I, act and interact thanks to Giddens and Mead. 4, our conscious life world shapes exactly how we interpret it all, drawing on Husserl. And finally, number 5, we use narratives to connect our own personal meaning to collective history, as Plummer taught us. Put it all together, and reflexive cultural materialism proves that society is just a continuous, dynamic negotiation between power, meaning, and your own consciousness. Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought, something for you to really chew on long after class is dismissed. If society really is this continuous interplay of material power and cultural meaning, how much of yourself is truly your own reflexive agency? There's no doubt you are undeniably shaped by the world around you, but armed with this new sociological lens, how will you choose to recreate it? Thank you so much for hanging out with me for this explainer today. Keep questioning those structures around you, and I'll see you in the next lecture.